It was a quiet evening in our Whisper Hollow bar. There weren't many customers. Tonight we had a group of young guys who were celebrating something. They were sitting at a table in the corner of the bar, drinking drinks and having fun. I stood behind the bar as I always did, wiping glasses. The door creaked open. A man in a ragged leather jacket with a tired look and a heavy gait entered the bar. A trucker, I thought, and as it turned out later, I was right. He walked across the bar, past the tables, and sank down on a stool at the counter. Whiskey, double, no ice. I poured it silently and watched the stranger take the first sip. It was like he was trying to wash away something bitter that sat in his throat. "How long have you been on the road?" I asked, more out of habit than interest. "Too long," the trucker replied hoarsely. "And it's even longer to drive." After a moment, one of the company guys in the corner of the bar shouted across the room, "Hey, old man, haven't you ever driven Route 13? The silence in the bar grew thicker for a moment. The trucker turned slowly, his fingers gripping the glass a little tighter. "I did." "And what really? What's going on out there?" The guy grinned, but there was a note of curiosity in his voice. The trucker sighed, finished his whiskey, and gestured for more. "If you want to know, I'll tell you. However, don't say I didn't warn you." The trucker sat down at the table with these guys. The bar fell into silence, and then the trucker began his stories. Story 1. Station 666, Voice of Darkness. Kevin Murphy turned on the ignition of his Ford Explorer as the clock on the dashboard ticked past midnight. He had just finished a double shift at the warehouse terminal. Now he had a long drive home along the treacherously deserted Route 13. "Crazy schedule," he grumbled. He turned on the radio to his favorite rock station, the one he always listened to on the road. The first alarm bell was the way the radio switched itself. One moment, absolute silence. Then a sharp scrape, as if someone had run his fingernails across a blackboard, and a whisper. "You. Next." Kevin leaned back in fright, pressing himself against the seat. The stereo display showed the frequency, 666 AM. What the hell was that? He slapped the dashboard, but the whispering continued. However, it was louder now. "They're waiting for you at the fork." Kevin turned off the radio. There was silence in the cabin, only the noise of the engine. He was beginning to calm down when, at that moment, his cell phone rang. Unknown number on the screen. Kevin put the receiver to his ear. "Hello?" The same whisper, now crisp and clear. "Turn left at the old mill." He threw the phone on the passenger seat, but the voice didn't stop. Now it was coming from the speakers of the stereo, even though it was turned off. "You're not the first, you won't be the last." A sign appeared in the headlights. "Old Mill, 1 mile." Kevin remembered the words of the voice. His hands were sweating, gripping the steering wheel. "It was just my imagination," he muttered. But he knew Route 13 had never been just a road. As he passed the dilapidated mill, the radio turned itself back on. "Stop!" a voice shouted. No longer a whisper, but the roar of 1,000 distorted voices. Kevin hit the brakes. Right in front of him, in the middle of the road, stood a figure in a black hoodie. No face. When Kevin came to his senses, the car was already on the side of the road. The radio was silent. The phone was off. Even the engine was dead. He took a deep breath and looked in the rearview mirror. There was someone else sitting in the back seat. A shadow leaned forward, and Kevin saw his own face, but with his eyes gouged out and his mouth sewn shut with wire. "You're next," the creature said in his voice. Kevin was found at dawn. The Ford Explorer was parked on the side of Route 13. Kevin sat in the driver's seat, with torn-out stereo wires wrapped around his wrists. He repeated one phrase over and over. "They know where I live. They know where I live." The doctors diagnosed psychosis. However, a night shift nurse later recounted that the radio in Kevin's room turned itself on every night at exactly 3 a.m., and played the same track. Kevin disappeared a month after he was discharged. They found in his house a radio tuned to 666 AM. Walls scrawled with one phrase, "They come over the airwaves." A tape recorder with a single recording, his own voice whispering warnings to other drivers. But the creepiest part? His Ford Explorer is still occasionally seen on Route 13. The stereo is playing at full volume. And in the passenger seat sits something that stares intently at passing cars, picking out the next one. Story 2. Black sedan disappearance on Route 13. The clock on Laura's Honda Civic's dashboard read 2:47 as they pulled onto a deserted stretch of Route 13. The radio had stopped working, and instead of cheerful music, there was only crackling and scraps of phrases coming out of the speakers. "I told you we should have left earlier," Laura said, picking up speed. Dan sprawled in the passenger seat. He was looking for cheerful music, lazily switching radio stations. It was then that he noticed two dim yellow circles in the mirror. "Someone's rear-ended me," he muttered. Laura glanced in the mirror. Behind her in the dark night, the outline of an old black sedan was clearly visible. Laura didn't think much of it at first. Maybe someone's lights had burned out? However, when she slowed down a little, the car behind her did the same, keeping exactly 3 feet away. Strange type, Laura thought, and stepped on the gas. The speedometer read 70 miles an hour. The sedan didn't lag an inch, as if it were tethered by an invisible tether. Dan rolled down the window and stuck out his hand, gesturing, "Overtake!" Only then did he notice the car had no license plates. And when Dan looked closer, he broke out in a cold sweat. Laura. She had no headlights at all. What they had mistaken for lights was the reflection of their own brake lights in the perfectly polished hood. At 3:13 AM, Laura couldn't take it anymore. She slammed her foot down hard on the brakes. The rubber squealed, their bodies forward. They were bound to hear the impact. However, when the Honda came to a stop, there was no impact from behind. Only a thick fog was billowing over the asphalt. "What's going on?" Dan peered through the windshield into the darkness. The silence was broken by a sharp knock on the glass, on the driver's side. Laura slowly turned her head. There was no one behind the glass. "Let's go," Dan said, his voice shaking. When the Honda started again, Laura looked in the rearview mirror, and she saw him. A man in a black suit sat in the back with his hands folded in his lap. His face was hidden by shadows. The smell of old leather and gasoline filled the cabin. "You shouldn't have stopped." A rough man's voice came from the back seat. In the morning, the local sheriff found the Honda Civic in the middle of Route 13. The doors were open. The engine was running. Dan's phone was on the dashboard, the screen showing an incomplete 911 call. What surprised the sheriff most, however, was the back seat. It was covered in a black, oily liquid. Forensics would later determine it was motor oil from the 70s, and they found 10 distinct fingerprints. It's like someone was holding on with all their might when the car forward or braked hard. When the sheriff opened the trunk, he was shocked. There was a black suit with a 1975 dry cleaning tag. In the suit pocket was a Polaroid photo. It showed Laura and Dan tied up in the back seat, their mouths sewn shut with fishing line. Since then, drivers have been talking about a black sedan with no headlights that appears behind them on Route 13. If you see it, don't slow down, because the one inside has been waiting a long time for companions. Story 3. Kids in the Fog on Highway 13. Priest James Caulfield gripped the steering wheel of his old Ford tighter as the first drops of rain drummed on the windshield. In the back seat, his 8-year-old daughter Emily slept peacefully. They were returning from Sunday service in a neighboring town and now had the last 15 miles of Route 13 to go. "God bless our journey," James whispered as he turned on the windshield wipers. He had no idea that in just a few minutes he would be praying not for a blessing, but for salvation. The first puffs of fog appeared suddenly, as if someone had spread a giant cotton blanket across the road. In seconds, visibility dropped to 0. James slowed down, feeling the car skid on the wet pavement. Emily woke up in the back seat. Emily. "Dad? What's going on?" "It's okay, sweetie, it's just—" He didn't finish. In the headlights, right in the middle of the road, there were 3 kids. They were lined up, holding hands. 2 boys and a girl, all about Emily's age. They were wearing old-fashioned clothes, like they were from the 50s. Plaid shirts, polka-dot sundresses, leather clogs. What struck James most of all were their faces. Very pale, white faces, and empty eye sockets. "Dad." Emily squeezed his shoulder. "Look, they're missing their eyes." Adrenaline pounded in his temples. James pressed the gas pedal to the floor. "Close your eyes, baby." The Ford sped forward, right through the little figures. James waited for the impact, the sound of a body hitting the hood. Instead, however, there was a loud thump on the roof, as if someone massive had jumped on top of the car. Emily screamed. The rear-view glass is cracked. Half a mile later, the fog suddenly cleared. James, with trembling hands, pulled the car over to the side of the road. "Are you all right?" He turned to his daughter. His voice trailed off. In the back seat, next to Emily, lay a doll, an antique porcelain doll in a sundress. Her eyes were neatly carved, and around her neck hung a shabby label that read, "Property of St. Mary's School, 1957. The next day, James returned to the scene with the sheriff. "Are you sure you saw the children?" the officer asked skeptically. 3, 2 boys and a girl." The sheriff sighed heavily and pulled a folder out of the car, minus St. Mary's School. In 1957, their school bus went missing in this area. The driver was found a week later. He was blinded and kept talking about kids in a fog. He showed James a yellowed photograph. 3 children dressed exactly like the ones they'd seen the previous night. 10 years after that incident, road workers found a rusty school bus. This bus was in a swamp near Route 13. Inside were 3 little skeletons holding hands. Story 4. Accidental passenger Route 13. The downpour hit Route 13 suddenly, turning the road into a churning torrent. Sarah Wilson pressed against the windshield of her Subaru, staring out the window at the curtain of water. The wipers could barely keep up with the torrents of water. "Illinois roads," she grumbled, slowing down to 20 miles per hour. It was then that he appeared in the headlights. The figure stood under a broken road sign. No umbrella, no bag. Just a man in a soaked denim jacket. His hand reached for the road in a classic hitchhiker's gesture. Sarah drove past. Sarah thought, "Stop on Route 13 at night? No way!" In the rearview mirror, she saw the figure drop his hand hopelessly. Something in the gesture made her brake sharply. "What a curse," she whispered, putting it in reverse gear. The door opened. The smell of wet wool and something else putrid permeated the inside of the car. "Thank you," the man's voice sounded muffled, as if from a barrel. He settled into the passenger seat, and Sarah caught a glimpse of his face, pale, with bluish circles under his eyes. Water dripped from his clothes, making puddles on the seat. "How far are you going?" Sarah asked, pulling out of her seat. The man didn't answer. He sat motionless, staring out the window. After 10 minutes of silence, Sarah began to get nervous. She looked warily at the passenger. His jeans were an old-fashioned cut, high-waisted. A watch with a cracked dial dangled from his wrist, stopped at 2:17. The water dripping off it was slimy, swampy in color. "Hey, are you all right?" Sarah asked. The man slowly turned his head. His eyes were unnaturally shiny like a fish's. "Stop at the next corner," he whispered. The rain stopped just before the turn the strange passenger had indicated. Sarah could see the house about 50 feet from the road. The house turned out to be an old farm cottage with peeling paint. A for sale sign swayed on the porch covered in mold. "Here we are," Sarah hit the brakes. "Do you, live here?" The passenger turned to her. In the light of the dashboard, his face suddenly seemed too pale, almost transparent. "Thank you," he said. "I died here in 1972. Sarah turned sharply. The seat was empty. However, a large wet puddle was left on the leather of the seat, which smelled like the odor of tarnish and decomposition. The next day, Sarah went back to that house. An old woman from a nearby cottage told her that a young farmer had lived there in 1972. "The boy was returning from a party in the same storm as yesterday," the old woman said. "His car was found in a ditch, and his body was not found until a week later. The day he died, the time stopped on his watch. 2:17 in the morning." She showed Sarah a yellowed newspaper with a photograph. In that picture, Sarah recognized her passenger. It was the same guy. Now when it rains, Sarah never stops on Route 13. Story 5. The Woman in White, the Ghost of Route 13. Mike Harlow was an experienced driver. 15 years behind the wheel of a truck had taken him all over the United States. He had seen everything from accidents on the highway to strange lights in the sky over Nevada. However, what happened to him on Route 13 that fall night? He couldn't forget even years later. It was already past 3 in the morning. Mike was taking a load to Chicago and decided to take a shortcut through an old suburban highway. Route 13 was deserted, sparse streetlights and endless cornfields. Very few abandoned farms along the way. The radio didn't work very well, and Mike drove in silence. That's when he saw her. On the side of the road, under a lonely streetlight, stood a woman in a white dress. Her figure seemed very thin. Her face was too pale, almost transparent. She waved her hand slowly, as if voting. Mike thought for a moment, and decided that stopping at night on a deserted highway wasn't the best idea. What was that woman doing here at this hour? He drove on by. In the rearview mirror, he saw her arm slowly lowered. Then, her head turned sharply, following Mike's departing truck. After driving a couple miles, Mike calmed down. He figured it was a local. Someone's car broke down. A couple minutes later, he saw her again. This time, she was standing right in the middle of the road in the light of the headlights. Her dress was fluttering, though there was no wind. Mike pressed the brake pedal to the floor. He almost flew into the ditch, but he managed to stop a meter away from her. His heart was pounding frantically. Mike jumped out of the cab, ready to shout at this crazy woman. However, the road was empty. Only ahead, in the light of headlights, lay a white handkerchief, as if it had just fallen out of someone's hands. Mike drove the rest of the way without letting go of the steering wheel. He could no longer see the woman, but he could feel her presence. He felt as if someone invisible was sitting next to him in the cab. When he reached Chicago, he checked into a motel room and went to sleep. He didn't wake up until noon. He made himself a strong cup of coffee and turned on the TV. A few minutes later, the news reported that the body of a woman was found in a field off Route 13. A farmer reported a strange discovery last night. The remains of a young woman wearing a white dress were found in an abandoned cornfield. According to police, the remains are at least 20 years old, but the clothing and body have hardly decomposed. The identity of the deceased is being established. Mike was shocked by the scene he saw. A week later, driving through the neighborhood again, he walked into a local bar, the Rusty Nail, and cautiously inquired about the woman in white. The bartender told him, "You're not the first person to see her. Turns out in 1975, a girl named Elizabeth Meyer went missing on Route 13. She was wearing a bridesmaid dress and was on her way to see her fiancé, but never made it. Her empty car was found on the side of the road, and Elizabeth herself was missing. She was never found. They say she's still looking for her way home," the bartender added. "And if you stop, she'll take you with her." Sometimes, driving Route 13 at dusk, he saw a pale face in the mirror, glimpsed among the corn. One morning, he found a woman's handprint on the windshield. It was as if someone had tapped on it while he slept. From then on, He always crossed himself when driving that stretch of road. If you're driving Route 13 at night and you see a woman in white, don't stop. She may get in your car and she may not want to get out. Want to hear more stories from the bartender? Subscribe to our channel. The continuation follows.